Welcome everybody to our March Maths Network. Today we are going to be focusing on approach 4, which is all about how we teach children to make comparisons and connections. And obviously that involves a lot of modelling as well. So this is one of the approaches that is supported by lots of research. Now let's look a little bit more into this. The session today is about how we do this, how we teach comparisons and connections. We know that it's an evidence-informed approach that supports children's understanding of the mathematical relationships. We're going to look at some examples of practice so we can see what this looks like in action. And we'll look at ways to help children notice difference and sameness. It's really important that we're drawing attention to sameness. We need that contrast so that children really understand what difference is. And we need to be making it playful, engaging, and we also need to include being really intentional so that we've planned for specific types of language and concepts that we want the children to come away with. So if we look at our statutory framework, this is the statement that really does relate to this approach. It is important that children develop positive attitudes and interests in mathematics. Look for patterns and relationships, spot connections. So in our statutory framework, it absolutely makes it really clear that we need to be facilitating the children's ability to spot connections, see patterns, find them, and develop that understanding of the relationship between different aspects of maths. It might be the relationships between numbers, it might be the relationships between different shapes, or the relationships between different positions. So we're really looking at all the different aspects of maths and all the different strands. They need to feel like they can have a go and talk to adults and peers about what they notice. And it's really important that they don't feel afraid to make mistakes. So we are in the business of creating a space in which the children want to experiment and want to have a go at discovering different aspects of maths without feeling like they are on the spot, that they might get something wrong. And that is an atmosphere that we create in our settings. So these are the 5, if you look at them all together, the 5 approaches supported by educational research. The teaching the association between number and quantity, which generally we spend quite a lot of our time doing as nursery practitioners or childminders. Promoting fluency with numbers and sequences is often something that we're drawn to. So again, that focus on number and counting. Then approach number 3 is about teaching problem-solving skills for maths. And that is really very much related to the teaching and modelling of how to make comparisons and connections. And what common thread runs through all of these is us needing to facilitate mathematical language. So if we plan really carefully across our year that we're going to look at specific strands to make sure that we don't leave anything to chance, we make sure that we use all of the rich vocabulary that underpins all of the different aspects of maths. And today we're going to look a bit more deeply into the type of language that we'd be using to model making comparisons and connections. So this is what the evidence says. When we compare sets of objects using words, identify the odd one out in sets of objects, arrange objects in order of size, location, or position, use ordinal numbers such as first, second, and third, and activities involving block building or weighing scales, we help children make comparisons and understand connections. Now, some people might find that the first stage of teaching the difference between different weights might not be the use of scales. It might be the use of holding buckets of different weights because it feels more real to the very, very young child. The scales are quite a wonderful visual, but in lots of practitioners' experience, it still feels a little bit abstract. It's quite difficult to remember to not touch the scales and not add weight to them by touching them. So think about the first stage of all of these things. So if you are ordering things in size from the smallest to the largest, your first stage will probably be talking about small and big, like you can see in this image where a practitioner has made a smaller circle in which to put the small animals and a bigger circle in which to put the bigger animals. So that's just a little idea of how to interpret and break down the learning. So you don't launch into ordering 5 objects in order of size, but rather start with small and big and just have those 2 objects. So we have an image here from our previous network meeting, but if we were to interact with the children wanting to draw out the language of comparison, we might use more language related to size, to height, to width, and to length. So we might say, oh, could you find a block that's long enough to reach across these 2 blocks? So we adjust and adapt the language, the key language that we know we want to draw out of the children. And the more we model it, the more likely it is for the children to start using it. We might leave a gap for the children to finish one of our sentences, hoping that they will use that newly introduced word. It might be that you want the children to make comparisons between different amounts. So you might start getting your conkers onto these pneumicons to count them precisely, and then your next stage might be to group together all of the 4 conkers that you can find, all of the 1 conkers, and arrange them in that way. And that way you're drawing attention to sameness. And that is a very important stage in understanding connections. Here you've got the Play-Doh where a child is making equal amounts of Play-Doh. So she's put 5 little bits of dough in each of her scallop shells. And that's a very simple little setup that is quite inviting for the children, you know, having a real shell there and having to put bits of your dough in there to count them precisely can invite that type of play where they can make those comparisons and also make that sameness. Now, if you, for instance, wanted to be drawing out the comparison here, rather than just focusing on the count, which is what we did last time, you might be drawing attention to the size. You might say to the child, oh, these are really big, the balls we've got in here. Let's see if you can find the smallest balls and see if we can put those in the 2 empty spaces we've got. So again, you're using that really precise language to draw attention to the difference and to the sameness. So we've got two big balls here, and then we're going to find the two really small balls. And you may incorporate that idea of the numerosity. We still have 4. And often what you'll find is that you will be looking at more than one of the approaches. Generally, 2 to 3 approaches will be being used. And most of the research looked at several approaches being used simultaneously. It's very difficult to isolate one approach from the other because everything's very connected. Trying to make myself light up just a little bit. It's getting very dark. So if you're using loose parts, for example, and we were talking about the arrangement of this face before, if you're wanting to draw out the language of sameness and difference, you might draw attention to the fact that they both have 2 eyes in their little pictures of a face. And one of them has got really big eyes and one of them has got much, much smaller eyes. And you can do all sorts of interesting things there. You might draw attention to how many eyes do you think will fit into that larger eye, and see what the children come up with. They might suddenly want to put lots of stones inside the large eye to see how many it might hold. But there you've drawn attention to the fact that they have the same amount, but the size is different. So if you look at the books that you have in your setting, it's really nice to put aside some books that you know are going to really support that language of sameness and difference. And these are some examples of books that you might be using. Most of them are to do with numerosity and counting. But this book here with the word more, that may be language that you want to be introducing when you're talking about difference. Here I have more and here I have fewer. And those are words that you'll be wanting the children to develop. More books here. So there's a lot of research being done at the moment to look at how we can use books to support children with their mathematical understanding. We know that interactive reading is incredibly powerful in supporting children with their vocabulary acquisition and with their general communication and language. So it stands to reason that if you're choosing texts that have a lot of mathematical language in them, you will be supporting them in developing mathematical vocabulary and concepts. So another place that you might want to go to delve deeper into this strand of mathematics is the National Centre of Excellence for the Teaching of Mathematics. And they've got these wonderful grids. This is on several pages. It just shows you what it is that you're looking for if you want to go and find them. If you're working on your curriculum, they're really helpful in breaking down the concepts and the type of words that you want to make sure the children are using. So do have a look at those. They're a very helpful planning tool. So when I looked through the comparison strand on the NCTEM's website, I then took out these words. And what you want to aim for is that you stick with those words that are simpler and then build. Now, in your setting, you will find that practitioners use different words because we're all different and we all emphasize words over others. So some of these words you might want to swap around. So you might find the word in the second column is actually is simpler for your group. And the word in the first column might be a little more complex. So it really does depend on your setting, on your adults, on the frequency of certain words being used. But generally, you will use the word same before you move on to the word equal. You might use not the same before you introduce the word different. So when you think of language acquisition, and some of you may have been on the speech and language training fairly recently, the idea of teaching not the same is easier than teaching the completely new word different because you've already taught the word same. And so the hook is there. It's the thing that is not the same. And that's a really good stage in language acquisition, especially where a child might have some difficulty in acquiring new words. So that hook is even more important, that connection that can be made to some prior learning or a prior word. You might use the word compare before you then move on to using the word contrast. So you can see you can add these words quite intentionally into your planning. You might be using more, and then later you might use larger amount, or you might find that using those two at the same time helps support the understanding of more. You might use fewer first and then smaller amount, although in some settings you may find it's easier to flip it the other way around. Use smaller amount first and then move on to fewer. Remember, when we're dealing with countable objects, objects that you can move or point to, we talk about fewer because they're countable objects. Where you can't count something, or it's along an abstract number line, you can talk about less. So that will generally be with liquids, with children who are very young. If we're filling and emptying, you might say, oh, I've got less red water in here, or I've got less juice, or I've got less milk, and I've got more in this one. But where the objects are countable, we introduce the word fewer, so that we're using the correct mastery language from an early stage. You might use lower and shorter. You might flip those over. It really is dependent on your setting and how much you use those words. Generally, we use big and small before we use large and little. And the comparative bigger, smaller, heavier, and lighter. So really think about being very intentional about using these words and planning them in. They're not words that are learned by osmosis necessarily. We have to be quite intentional in using them. So if you're comparing the properties of your shapes, a really lovely activity you could do is to notice the properties of the shapes. Yes, we might be teaching the names of some very easy to spot shapes like a regular triangle, a square and a circle. Really useful to know those and to spot those. But before we go on to talking about the hexagon and the pentagon, it's really great to draw attention to the properties of those shapes and talk about the corners and talk about the points and talk about the sides and then the edges. Because that way we draw attention to the children noticing the properties. And you could organize them and say, oh, let's see how many things have got 3 points. And you put those all in one place. Let's see how many have got more than 3 points and arrange them and talk about them. And then you can mention, oh, these all look quite different, but because they all have 3 points, they are actually all triangles. And all sorts of rich and interesting language can come out of that. If you're comparing amounts, this is a lovely, simple game that you can play where you can colour a stone on one side and have it with a different color on the other side. And if you want to reinforce a particular amount and get the children to notice amounts within amounts, and you want them to compare how many blue ones there are related to how many white ones there are, this is a game that's very rich, and you can support the children's understanding in many different areas here. So if you want to reinforce the fiveness of 5, you would choose to have just the 5 stones, and then you can throw them. And depending on how they land, you can notice that there's 1 white one and 4 blue ones. Here, the children had moved on and they were ready to look at the different amounts within 7. And they can only see 2 groups here because you've only got 2 sides to the stone. So that way you're limiting it. And this is just a very sweet game that you can do. And once they grasp it, you can start developing the idea of recording it, where you allow the children to do a little bit of tallying. So you might say, oh, let's see if you can count how many blue ones we have. Now you're going to check how many that is. Let's count with you so that you know how many lines to make. And then the adult might scribe the numerals to show them this way of recording. And incidentally, the more we model recording, the more we model writing for a reason, the more our children will be invested in recording things, in noticing things, in drawing, in then later writing. Because actually not much writing goes on nowadays. Everything's so digital. So where we have opportunities to record, to have a message, to do something like this, where we show them how their tallies can be put together, it's a really nice first stage before moving on later. They'll be doing their number problems. Now, the starting point of looking at the difference in amounts might be using loose parts and having a little group session where you allow the children to quite freely make arrangements, and then you can add in what you notice and narrate what you see the children gathering. And you might say, oh, I can see there's a really small one there. Perhaps you could fit it inside the really big one. And you could do lots of assessing there to see if they can follow your instruction, if they've actually understood those words, or if you need to create more scenarios where you reinforce what the small means and what the bigger means. You might talk about the different sizes of the leaves or the different sticks that you might have. So those open-ended arrangements will give you lots and lots of opportunities to talk about sameness and difference. You might want to incorporate comparisons and connections into your large block play and talk about, let's see if we can make a bridge across here. I think we're going to need a really long plank to reach the other side. So you're intentionally using the word reach the other side across a really long plank. And all of those mathematical terms are going to help the children develop their vocabulary so they can express their mathematical understanding. So if you're using words like, I wonder how, you're opening it up to the possibilities and for them to problem solve and work things out. I wonder how we're going to get across to the other side. What might we need? I think you're right. We do need a longer plank. Or it's flipping over. This one's not quite working. I think it's too long. What could we get? And draw out of the children. It needs to be a shorter one. Let's see if we can find a shorter one. Or could we use this short block instead of the long plank? And that way you're building in all of that language. the idea of how can you is again opening it up to the children, an open-ended opportunity. If you want to support the children in making comparisons with the amounts that they're playing with, the amounts of calendula that they've picked to make some calendula oil, they might have to check how many they've got in relation to how many need to go into the jar. The children who are playing with the liquids, you might be talking about how one of the cups has less tea in it than the other cup, or let's try and make the tea in the cafe have the same amount so that we're giving our customers the right amount of tea. It may be that you have lovely little containers and you're limiting how much the children can pour from one container into another so that you can really break down how many spoonfuls you're going to add to fill your little bowl. On the right here, we've got two children really invested in scraping up their chalk. It's the end of a chalk, and they're turning it into a paste, which they're then going to make a paint with. And there's all sorts of language there about how it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller as we scrape bits away. So it's really entering the fascinations of the children and finding ways to use that target language so that it's useful to the children. You could be weaving in the target language at their fascination with making train tracks, and you want to make a train track with them that fills the entire space that you have. You want it to reach from one door to the other wall at the other end so that it goes right across the space. And you can use all that language related to length. And you might be doing that when you're talking about the height of the different constructions that they're making with their block play. Or you might be really fascinated to compare the different sized insects that you've brought in from the garden, and you're looking at in a tray. You might be watching how the different insects are moving and use that comparative language, that this one is moving really fast. This one's much slower as it wiggles across. Oh, we've come back to the dough. I'm very fond of this dough. I think there's so much that can be done with dough, and often the children just want to have a chat about home life. And if that's what they're interested in, don't weave in the mathematical language if it's going to put them off. But if you've presented the dough in little balls, it's more likely to invite counting and to invite comparison and arrangements within the shells. So that's something to think about, how we present things. So if we are outside, for instance, and we are looking inside some real pumpkins, you're going to discover that there are many seeds inside. And you can talk about the tiny seeds and the big chunks that we're going to put into our soup. And you might be weaving, and you need to have bits of willow that are exactly the same length. And there you can compare and say, oh, this stick's a bit too short. It's not going to go across to the other side. So you can see there are lots of opportunities where you can weave this language in. You might decide that within your group, whether it's a childminder setting of different ages, or whether it's a small key worker group within a nursery or a nursery class, 2-year-olds even, you can provide a lot of the same resource, and you can have a 1-minute timer, put that 1-minute timer on and say, right, okay, we're all going to make some towers. Let's see how quickly we can make our towers. And then once that minute is over, you've then got the opportunity to build in that comparative language and talk about the towers that are the same length. Oh, let's see how many people have got a tower the same length. Now, these blocks are great because they stick together quite well. They're unifix, and then you can compare them and they can go around, find one that is the same, and they carefully put it against the carpet. So they're measuring it accurately against their friends. And then you can take it to putting them in the order of size and get the children to help each other in doing that. And it's actually really fun, and the children get really invested in participating. When you're thinking about connections and difference and sameness with our very youngest children, it may be that we're just drawing attention to them having one ball in each hand, or talking about it being all gone. All the seeds are gone once you've blown them all off the dandelion clock. So it's being intentional about what word you use in that situation or at that stage in your term, because you know that you've covered some different areas and now you want to draw attention to being there and then not being there and playing your peekaboo. Again, we've talked about collections, but here you might want to order your collection and notice that you can put them in the order of their size. And once you have done categorizing, you can talk about a big leaf, a small seed, a big leaf and a small seed. But you see here, where you've created a pattern, you're drawing attention to the bigness and the smallness of the elements in the pattern. It goes big, small, big, small. In a different situation, you might be drawing attention to the type, leaf, seed, leaf, seed. So really think about which aspect you want to emphasize. Here you might be talking about what do you see, how many do you have altogether, but if you're wanting to talk about sameness and difference, you might say, what is the same here? And the children might notice that all of the cubes are of the same size. And they might notice that some are blue and some are red, and that is different. So you can use activities to support your counting, or if you're wanting them to have their attention drawn to sameness and difference, it really is about how you interact and those questions that you use and the narration that you use, and adapt it according to the area that you want to emphasize. So our concluding notes are that the approach of modelling and teaching, making connections and comparisons, helps children develop an understanding of mathematical relationships, which is really important for their later mathematical learning. Resources, planning our language and our spaces provide opportunities for children to develop in this area. So we need to dedicate time to choosing our key language, thinking of the types of activities that we can present that will invite that type of language to be rehearsed and revisited. Think about the types of resources that we might want to have and how we might arrange those. So I'd like you to think about how you might already be facilitating making comparisons and connections. And are there little tweaks that you could make to your planning or to a book that you might want to use, or a routine that you want to weave comparisons and connections into? Or is there something you want to add in to your way of interacting with the children to support them more in this area? Or is it an area that you feel you already do a lot of work around and you could share with our group the types of things that you've been finding to be really successful in drawing the children's attention to comparison, sameness, and connection.